Does more range really matter on an EV road trip? In order to answer that question, I tested out a number of cars, from ones with low range all the way to the range leader, on a 2,500-mile virtual road trip. Find out which EV was the fastest. You'll be surprised by the results. I recently went on a painful 3,000-mile road trip in my Kia EV6. Our typical distance between charging stops was only about 100 to 130 miles, far less than the 274-mile range of my car. Why was that? Well, for one, it had to do with keeping the battery in the zone of 10 to 80% state of charge, where it charges the fastest. The other limiting factor was the scarcity of chargers. So that made me wonder, if I was only going 100 or so miles between chargers, does more range really matter? We obsess so much about the range of EVs. Every time a new EV comes out, the first thing we want to know is how far does it go? We focus on small differences in range and celebrate the ones that break records. So I wanted to know, in which EV would I have completed the trip the fastest? In a car with a range in the low 200 miles, like a Volvo XC40, or in a car with a range of over 500 miles, like a Lucid Air? Would the extensive supercharger network give Tesla an advantage? And how would slower charging speed, like in a Mach-E, affect the outcome? Well, to answer all these questions, I devised a virtual race using a better route planner. The route for this race is the same as what I covered in our real road trip. This trip took us from the Bay Area to Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Taos, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and then back to the Bay Area over the course of 14 days. For all these routings, I'll use the default settings in ABRP, including that for calculating a route with the quickest arrival time. First, let's establish the baseline, which would be for my Kia EV6. My EV6's all-wheel drive has a 77 kilowatt-hour battery, an EPA range of 274 miles, a max charge power of 240 kilowatts, and costs about $58,000. Per ABRP, this trip would require 19 charge stops, totaling 4 hours and 30 minutes. This leads to an average time of just over 14 minutes per charge. You can see that lines up pretty closely with what is shown on the map. The distance covered is just over 2,500 miles in a time of just over 41 hours. That leads to an average distance of 130 miles between charges, which you can see reflected in the planner also. The total time for the trip, including driving and charging, is 45 hours and 39 minutes. Given that the average distance between chargers is only 130 miles, I wondered how a car with a range in the low 200 miles would fare. I picked the all-electric Volvo XC40, which has a 78 kilowatt-hour battery, costs about $55,000, but has an EPA range of only 223 miles. Per ABRP, the XC40 would need a whopping 28 charges totaling 15 hours and 6 minutes. Because of the 150 kilowatt peak charge power, the XC40's average charge session would be 32 minutes, twice as long as the Kia's. Some charge sessions would even run over an hour. Due to its limited range on some legs, there is a caution to drive at a maximum of 70 miles an hour. And also, because of its limited range, there is a detour of a couple of 100 miles just to get to a charger. The total distance covered is about 100 miles more than with the EV6. With 28 charge stops, the average distance between them is only 93 miles. The total time for this trip? Almost 60 hours. A whopping 14 and a half hours more than the EV6. The XC40 suffers from a double whammy on this road trip: low range and slow peak charge power. But what if we had a car that was equal to the EV6 in range, but had a slower peak charge power? How would that trip look? I decided to test that out with the Mustang Mach-E all-wheel drive extended range. The 2022 model has a 91 kilowatt-hour battery, delivering 277 miles of range, very close to the EV6's 274. It costs about $56,000. The total distance traveled and the time it would take are very close to the EV6 as a result of the ranges being close. This planner requires 20 charge stops, just one more than the EV6. But the big difference is the time spent charging. The time spent charging at about 8.5 hours is almost twice that of the EV6, and so is the average time per charge. And this simply has to do with the fact that the peak charge power of the Mach-E is 150 kilowatts compared to the 240 of the EV6. Now keep in mind that this is all a virtual comparison. In the real world, this would all be quite different. The EV6 only benefits from the higher peak charge power when plugged into a 350 kilowatt charger. And those may be taken when you arrive, and so you may have to plug into a 150. And even if you're plugged into a 350, it may not necessarily deliver you the peak power that these theoretical calculations are based on. As we found out in our real-world experience, our average charge time to 80% was about 13 minutes, very close to the ABRP predicted average of 14 minutes. But our average total charge time was 30 minutes because we ended up taking longer for restroom or meal breaks. That 30 minutes is very close to the average charge time for the Mach-E. So in the real world, the Mach-E and the EV6 could very well end up with similar charging and total travel times. One of the things that was apparent during my trip is that the maximum distance we could travel was limited by the scarcity of chargers. As you'll see from these routings, no matter which car you drive, you're pretty much stopping at the same chargers. Because that's all there is. You don't have much choice. So that made me wonder, what if I had done this trip in a Tesla? The supercharger network is far more extensive, and so that should allow the car to travel further between stops, right? I chose the Tesla Model Y long range, which is the closest competitor to the EV6. It has an 82 kilowatt-hour battery, an EPA range of 330 miles, and costs $66,000. So here's what ABRP came up with. Because of its longer range compared to the EV6, it is able to take a shortcut on one of the legs. As a result, the total distance traveled is slightly less. But interestingly, ABRP came up with 22 charge stops for the Model Y compared to the 19 for the EV6. The average charge stop time at 16 minutes was comparable between the two. But given that the range of the Model Y is more than that of the EV6, I was puzzled by why there were more stops in the EV6. I would have expected to see fewer stops given the longer range and extensive supercharger network. Adding more stops also added to the total charge time at 6 hours and 8 minutes. The total time for the driving and charging would be 47 hours and 46 minutes. To see if there was a faster routing, I went to the Tesla website and planned out the same trip. That came up with 19 charge stops with an average of 30 minutes per stop. This is because the Tesla algorithm prioritizes fewer but longer charges over ABRP's algorithm of more but faster charges. The total trip time would be about 50 hours, which is more than that from ABRP, so we'll stick with the ABRP routing. I'm still a little puzzled as to why the Model Y didn't fare better, so if any of my smart viewers has an answer, please share in the comments below. Even though in this specific routing the supercharger network didn't give the Model Y an advantage over the EV6, the extensive network does make a difference overall. There are parts of the country that are charging deserts where there are no Electrify America chargers, but there are superchargers. And that's the difference between being able to get to a destination or not. So there's definitely benefit from the supercharger network. And as it looks like Tesla will soon be opening up its network in the US to all EVs, we can all take advantage of that benefit. Then there's the Lucid Air Dream Edition. The reigning range champion, it has a jaw-dropping EPA range of 520 miles, far beyond any other car we've looked at. It's also got a peak charge power of 300 kilowatts. But it also has a jaw-dropping price of $169,000. So how does the Lucid Air do on this trip? Well, as expected, it has fewer charge stops. At 10 stops, that's about half those of the EV6. But take a look at this. The average time per stop is 31 minutes, more than twice that of the EV6's 14 minutes. That's because the Dream Edition has a massive 118 kilowatt-hour battery, compared to the 77 of the EV6. And so naturally, it takes more time to charge. As a result, the total time spent charging is 5 hours and 11 minutes, more than the 4.5 hours of the EV6. The total time to complete this trip is 45 hours and 6 minutes. In this virtual race, the Lucid Air beats out the EV6 by a mere 33 minutes. And this was a surprising result for me. Going into this analysis, my gut feeling was that the Lucid would be the fastest, but I envisioned that it would be faster by a much bigger margin. Lucid's strategy of delivering a huge range number from an equally huge battery doesn't really deliver significant time benefits on a long road trip. You could do the trip in about the same time in an EV6 or similar car and save yourself the extra $100,000. Nevertheless, there are benefits of the 520-mile range. It allows you to go into areas off the interstates like national parks. Cars with ranges in the 200 or 300 miles may struggle to make it into a national park and back out if there are no chargers in the park. That 500-mile range would also allow you to cross some of the charging deserts we looked at earlier. One very interesting thing I noticed with the Lucid routing is that it most closely resembles a road trip in a gas car. The average distance between chargers would be 235 miles. That's about 4 hours of driving, and that's how I road trip in a gas car. I drive about 3 to 4 hours before stopping for an hour-long break to eat, use the restrooms, and fill up gas. So doing the road trip in a Lucid would feel very familiar. Only I can't afford to spend $169,000 on a car. So I'll keep dreaming for a car that can go 500 miles and costs about $60,000, or better yet, to be affordable to more Americans, costs around $30,000. Now, of course, this virtual race would look quite different in the real world. You would have to deal with a whole bunch of unpredictable variables. These would include dealing with things like broken chargers, uneven power delivery, waiting for a charger, and not always finding a vacant 350 charger. So this type of virtual race analysis certainly has its limitations. But nonetheless, it shows us a few important things. First, it shows that a car with a range in the low 200 miles and a slow peak charge power like the XC40 really struggles on a road trip this size. It also shows that a car with a huge range and huge battery like the Lucid Air really doesn't deliver any significant time benefits. And then it shows that as long as you have a car with a range in the high 200 miles or above, adding more range really doesn't matter. If you exclude the XC40 and look at the fastest one, the Lucid Air, and the slowest one in that group, the Mach-E, the difference between the two is about 10%. That's well within a real-world error of margin. Essentially, the total travel time of those cars is within the same ballpark, and in a real-world scenario, more range really wouldn't deliver much benefit. So what will it take to get to the point where more range really matters? If you look at the longest distance between chargers for these ABRP routings, they are nowhere close to the EPA ranges of the cars. There's a number of factors that affect range, including speed, elevation change, wind, temperature, etc. But I want to focus in on two other factors. One factor is the density of the charging infrastructure. In order to really squeeze the last few miles out of the battery, we would need a much denser charging infrastructure. I suspect chargers would need to be spaced more like 25 miles apart rather than the current 100 miles or so. And the other factor is this business of high-power charging occurring only between 10% and 80% of the battery. Frankly, on my trip, I felt kind of cheated. I had paid for a car with a 77 kilowatt-hour battery, but could effectively use only 70% of that figure. I understand that the charge power needs to drop down in order to protect the battery, but could the engineers figure out how to make those margins smaller? Perhaps 5% at either end, so it could charge at peak power between 5 and 95%? That would allow us to use 90% of the battery and go further. But I expect it's going to be a while before either of those issues are solved. In the meanwhile, I don't think we need to obsess about range. Despite the breathless marketing and one-upmanship from manufacturers and drivers fixating about range, until our infrastructure catches up, we're pretty much in the same boat. This analysis was certainly an eye-opener for me. But I'd like to know what you think. Any surprises? Any thoughts from your own road tripping experiences? Let me know in the comments below. Please also consider making a donation using Super Thanks. It will support the many hours that I put into making these videos. Thank you for watching. Please give the video a like, share your comments below, and subscribe to the Driver Download.